Don't ruin this for us tonight, Walter. Those were the words my daughter-in-law said to me 30 minutes before Thanksgiving dinner. While I was standing in her kitchen, holding a pumpkin pie I had spent 3 hours baking from scratch. My son Brian didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He just kept carving the turkey like I wasn't standing there with my hands shaking. "Melissa's stressed out, Dad," he muttered. "Just try not to start anything." Start anything? I had driven nearly 80 miles through freezing rain to spend Thanksgiving with my own family. I brought groceries. I brought gifts for the grandkids. Hell, I even paid for the new furnace in their house 2 months earlier when Brian said money was tight. And somehow, by the time the night started, I was already being treated like a problem nobody wanted around. Ethan, my 16-year-old grandson, was the only one who looked uncomfortable. "Grandpa didn't do anything," he said quietly. Melissa snapped back so fast the whole kitchen went silent. "Ethan, upstairs." Now, the kid looked at me with this helpless expression before walking away, and I swear that hurt worse than anything else. Because someone in that house still knew right from wrong. Before I tell you what happened that night, I just want to ask something small. If this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever felt unwanted by the people you sacrificed everything for, maybe take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if this story truly resonates with you. And I'd really love to know where you're watching from tonight, along with your local time. There's something comforting about knowing people from all over the world are listening. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 72 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. And the night before Thanksgiving last year was the night my family shattered in a way I never thought possible. Looking back now, I think the signs had been there for years. I just kept making excuses because that's what fathers do. My wife passed away 8 years ago from breast cancer. After that, I poured everything I had left into my kids. Brian needed help with his mortgage. I sold my fishing boat. Angela needed tuition money after her divorce. I emptied half my retirement savings without blinking. When Brian lost his job during the pandemic, I kept his family afloat for almost 9 months. Never complained once. Never asked for a dime back. But somewhere along the line, helping stopped making me family and started turning me into something else. Something useful. Something temporary. Something easy to ignore once they got comfortable again. That Thanksgiving Eve, Brian's house smelled like rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles. Christmas music was already playing softly through the speakers. Outside, cold rain tapped against the windows while the wind bent the trees in the backyard. It should have felt warm. Instead, the whole place felt tense the second I walked in. Melissa barely hugged me. Angela kept checking her phone. Brian looked exhausted before dinner even started. Then I noticed something strange. The dining table was fully set, except there wasn't a seat for me. I stood there staring for a second, thinking maybe I missed something. 11 plates. 11 glasses. But there were 12 people in the house. Melissa noticed me looking. "Oh," she said flatly. "We figured you'd probably be more comfortable eating in the den. The chairs in here are a little tight." I looked around that dining room, and every chair was perfectly normal. Nobody said a word. Not Brian. Not Angela. Nobody. I felt this heat rise into my chest, but I swallowed it down because I didn't want to ruin Thanksgiving. Isn't that pathetic? A 72-year-old man standing in his own son's house, trying not to make other people uncomfortable while they slowly erase him from the room. So I picked up my plate and smiled like an idiot. "The den's fine," I said. Then came the pie. I reached to move it off the counter when Melissa brushed past me carrying a tray. My elbow clipped the edge by accident. The pie slid sideways and hit the floor upside down. Silence. Absolute silence. Melissa stared at the mess like I'd committed a crime. "Are you serious right now?" she whispered. I said I'm sorry. I answered immediately, already kneeling to clean it up. Brian slammed the knife down on the counter hard enough to make me flinch. "Dad, for God's sake," he muttered under his breath. Then Melissa folded her arms and looked directly at my son. "I can't do this anymore." Something about the way she said it made my stomach turn cold, because this suddenly wasn't about a pie anymore. And deep down, I realized they'd already made a decision about me before I ever walked through that front door. Melissa grabbed a roll of paper towels and shoved them toward me without even looking me in the eye. "Just clean it up before the kids come back downstairs," she said coldly. I stayed on my knees wiping pumpkin filling off the hardwood floor while everyone else drifted back into their conversations like nothing had happened. The smell of cinnamon and burnt butter hung in the air, and for some reason that made the whole thing feel even sadder. I remember staring at the crushed pie crust beside my shoe and thinking how strange it was that a person could spend 40 years building a family and still end up feeling like an unwanted guest in it. Brian finally walked over after a minute, but he did not help me clean. He lowered his voice instead. "Dad, Melissa has been under a lot of pressure lately. Can you just try to keep things smooth tonight?" I looked up at him and almost laughed because I honestly did not know what I had done wrong. "I knocked over a pie, Brian. It is not just the pie." That sentence stayed in my head, because he said it like there had been a list building for years behind my back and nobody ever bothered to show it to me. Angela avoided eye contact the entire evening. That was her way. My daughter hated conflict so much she would rather pretend not to notice cruelty happening right in front of her. Even as a little girl, she was like that. Brian, on the other hand, learned early that whoever controlled the room got what they wanted. Maybe that was my fault too. I worked 18-hour days most of their childhood trying to keep food on the table after the recession hit in the 1980s. Back then I owned a small towing and repair garage outside Columbus near Route 40. It was nothing fancy. 3 bays. A faded red Coke machine out front. Gravel parking lot full of rusted pickups. But it fed my family. Every morning before sunrise, I would drive Brian to hockey practice in my old Ford, while Angela slept in the back seat under blankets because your mother and I could not afford babysitters. "Dad, watch this," Brian used to yell on the ice. "Did you see that shot?" And I always yelled back like he was playing in the National Hockey League instead of some freezing community rink at 6 in the morning. When Angela wanted piano lessons, I worked weekends. When Brian blew out his knee senior year and lost his scholarship chances, I took out a second mortgage so he could still attend Ohio State. Never once held it over his head. That is what eats at you when you get older. The memories are not made of huge sacrifices. They are made of tiny ones. The $20 bills slipped into backpacks. The nights fixing bicycles in the garage at midnight. Sitting in emergency rooms half asleep because your kid had the flu. Missing vacations because braces cost too much. Nobody remembers those moments except the parent who lived them. Around 7 that night, Ethan quietly came downstairs while I was washing dishes alone. He leaned beside me and whispered, "Grandpa, are you okay?" I forced a smile. "Course I am, buddy." The kid glanced toward the dining room to make sure nobody was listening. "Mom says you make everybody uncomfortable sometimes. But I do not think that is true." That nearly broke me right there. Because children notice everything adults think they hide. I dried my hands slowly and asked him, "Do you know what your dad wanted for Christmas when he was your age?" Ethan shook his head. A used hockey stick signed by Wayne Gretzky. Ethan laughed softly. "Seriously? I drove 3 hours through a snowstorm to Cleveland to buy it from some guy in a gas station parking lot." Did he freak out? Thought it was the greatest thing he had ever seen. Ethan smiled for a second, then his face changed when he heard Melissa calling his name upstairs. Before leaving, he leaned close and whispered something that made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. "Grandpa, I heard Mom and Dad talking about you before you got here. I do not think they want you staying after tonight." The second Ethan walked away, I felt this strange heaviness settle into my chest. Not anger, not even sadness anymore. Just exhaustion. The kind that creeps into a man after years of pretending not to notice things that should have broken him a long time ago. Upstairs, I could hear cabinet doors slamming while Melissa rushed around getting dinner ready. Football commentary echoed from the living room television. Somebody laughed too loudly at something Brian said, and for a moment I stood alone at the kitchen sink staring out at the dark backyard while rain streaked down the glass like melting ice. Then my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I almost ignored it. Hardly anybody called me anymore except telemarketers and my doctor's office. But when I pulled it out, I saw a name I had not seen in nearly 15 years. Frank DeLuca. I blinked twice just to make sure I was reading it right. Frank and I used to run tow routes together back in the 90s before he moved to Indianapolis. We had not spoken since my wife's funeral. I answered quietly. "Frank." The man practically shouted into the phone. "Walter Hayes, you stubborn old bastard, you still alive?" For the first time that entire night, I laughed. A real laugh. "Barely," I said. "Well, I just saw your name in the state registry this morning and figured I would try the number." "What registry?" "The Ohio Commercial Restoration Program." I frowned immediately because I had no idea what he was talking about. Frank lowered his voice. "Do not tell me you forgot." Then it hit me. 6 months earlier, Ethan helped me fill out an old state application online for retired small business owners affected during the recession years. I never expected anything from it. Honestly, I barely remembered submitting it. "Walter," Frank said, "they approved you." I straightened so fast the kitchen chair behind me scraped across the floor. Approved me for what? $350,000. I thought I misheard him. What? Grant money. Restoration funds. You qualify because your garage shut down during the 2008 freight collapse. They are reopening applications for independent operators. Hell, your story got featured in the local business bulletin this morning. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. $350,000. That was not rich people money, but to a 72-year-old man who had spent years counting every gallon of gas and every grocery receipt, it sounded unreal. Frank kept talking excitedly. "Walter, this could get you back on your feet. You could reopen Hayes Towing, even part-time." Hayes Towing. I had not heard someone say the business name out loud in years. Suddenly, I could almost smell motor oil and winter air again. I could see the old neon sign glowing beside the highway. Then a voice behind me shattered the moment. "What is this about money?" Melissa stood near the doorway holding a wine glass. I had not even heard her walk in. I turned slightly. "It is nothing. Did he just say $300,000? Her tone changed instantly. Softer. Interested. That was the thing about people. You learn a lot by how fast their voice changes when money enters the room. Brian appeared behind her seconds later. "Dad?" he asked carefully. "What is going on?" I looked at both of them standing there suddenly attentive after ignoring me most of the night, and something inside me shifted. Normally I would have smiled awkwardly and explained everything. I would have tried making everybody comfortable again. But this time, I did not. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and simply said, "It is private." The silence afterward felt enormous. Melissa blinked like she genuinely did not know how to process the word no coming from me. Brian forced a laugh. "Private? Since when do we keep secrets from each other?" I looked directly at him. "Since tonight, apparently." His expression hardened immediately. Not furious. Worse. Defensive. Like he suddenly realized the balance inside that house had changed by 1 inch, and he did not like the feeling. Dinner was called a few minutes later, but the atmosphere had turned strange. Too polite. Too careful. Melissa suddenly insisted I sit at the main table after. "Oh." Brian poured me bourbon without asking. Angela kept glancing between everybody nervously, while Ethan looked completely confused by the sudden change in attitude. And right in the middle of dinner, while the wind rattled the windows outside and Thanksgiving music played softly in the background, Brian cleared his throat and said something that made my stomach drop all over again. "Dad, maybe we should finally talk about the house." The second Brian mentioned the house, every sound around the table seemed to fade into the background. The forks stopped clinking. Even the football game from the living room suddenly felt distant. I slowly set my bourbon glass down and looked at him carefully. "What about the house?" Brian forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Nothing bad. We just thought maybe it is time to talk realistically." Melissa jumped in immediately. "Walter, nobody wants you living alone anymore. We worry about you." That almost would have sounded believable if she had not spent the last 3 hours treating me like a burden sitting in her dining room. Angela finally spoke up softly. "Dad, maybe you should hear them out." There it was. The setup. I could feel it now. Every strange look. Every whisper when I walked into a room. Every awkward silence when money got mentioned. This conversation had been planned long before I arrived. Brian leaned forward and folded his hands together like a banker discussing a loan. "Your place is getting older. The property taxes keep going up. You said yourself the furnace barely works. I fixed the furnace last winter. That is not the point." Melissa sighed dramatically. "We are just thinking long-term here." I stared at both of them across the Thanksgiving table I had practically paid for over the years. Long-term for who? Nobody answered right away. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside me while Angela stared down at her plate. Then Brian finally cleared his throat. "We think it makes sense for you to sell the house." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because of the house itself. It was just a modest 2-bedroom place outside Columbus with creaky hardwood floors and a detached garage. But it was the last place my wife ever lived. The kitchen still had pencil marks on the wall showing the kids' heights growing up. Her gardening gloves still hung beside the back door. "Sell it," I repeated quietly. Melissa nodded quickly. You could move into one of those nice senior communities. Somewhere safer. Somewhere with people your age. People my age. Funny how quickly families start talking like you are already halfway gone. Brian reached for his drink before continuing. And honestly, with the grant money coming in, now would be the perfect time. That sentence snapped something into place in my head. Suddenly, I understood why their attitude had changed after the phone call. It was not concern. It was opportunity. Melissa leaned toward me with this fake, sympathetic expression that made my skin crawl. Walter, we have sacrificed a lot helping you these past few years too. I actually blinked at her because for a second I wondered if I heard her correctly. Helping me? Brian immediately added, nobody is attacking you, Dad. Then why does this feel like an ambush? Silence. Heavy silence. Angela finally spoke carefully. Brian told us your retirement savings are almost gone. I turned toward my son slowly. You discussed my finances with everybody? We are family. No, I said quietly. Families ask permission first. Melissa crossed her arms. Honestly, Walter, you are being defensive for no reason. Ethan suddenly looked confused. Wait, Grandpa paid for Dad's truck last year. The room froze instantly. Brian snapped toward his son. Ethan, stay out of this. But the damage was done. Ethan looked around the table innocently. I heard Dad tell Mom Grandpa covered the payments when the dealership threatened repossession. Melissa's face tightened immediately. Angela looked stunned. Brian, is that true? My son rubbed his forehead hard. It was temporary. I sat there staring at him while years of tiny memories started connecting together in ways I had never allowed myself to see before. Every emergency, every crisis, every check I quietly wrote because they needed help. And somehow, in their version of the story, I had become the dependent one. Melissa suddenly pushed her chair back. This is exactly why we cannot have productive conversations with him. Him, not Walter, not Dad, just him. Like I was some difficult stranger ruining the evening. Brian stood up too now, frustrated and red-faced. Dad, nobody forced you to help us financially. I looked directly at my son. No, you just kept taking. His jaw tightened instantly. That is unfair. Is it? For the first time all night, nobody had an answer ready. Rain hammered harder against the windows outside while the room sat in complete silence. Then Brian said something that made the entire night finally collapse for good. Maybe Melissa was right. Maybe staying here tonight is not a good idea after all. Nobody at the table tried to stop me. That was the part one kept replaying in my head afterward. Not one person said, Dad, wait. Not Brian. Not Angela. Not even Melissa pretending to be polite anymore. I stood there slowly putting on my old brown coat while plates of Thanksgiving food cooled around the room and football commentary echoed from the television in the next room like some normal American holiday was still happening. Ethan looked panicked. Grandpa, you do not have to leave. Brian immediately cut him off. Enough. I looked at my grandson and forced the best smile I could manage. It is okay, buddy. But it was not okay. Every person in that house knew it. The rain outside had turned colder by then, almost sleet. I remember carrying my overnight bag to the front door while Melissa quietly whispered something to Brian that made both of them glance toward my jacket pocket where my phone sat. The same phone that had rung with news about the grant money less than an hour earlier. Suddenly, all their concern about my health and safety made a lot more sense. Before opening the door, I turned back one last time. You know, I said quietly, your mother used to worry this family would stop loving each other once money got involved. Brian rubbed both hands across his face. Dad, do not do this right now. No, I answered. I think this is exactly the right time. Angela finally stood up from the table, looking close to tears. Walter, maybe everybody just needs space tonight. Walter, not Dad. Funny how quickly titles disappear when people no longer see value in you. I nodded slowly and walked outside into the freezing rain. Nobody followed me except Ethan, who ran onto the porch without a jacket. Grandpa, he shouted. I turned around halfway to my truck. The kid looked miserable. Call me when you get home, okay? My throat tightened so hard I could barely speak. I will. Then the front door opened behind him and Melissa called sharply. Ethan, inside. Now. He hesitated before walking back in. The door shut behind him. And just like that, I was alone. The drive back toward Columbus should have taken about an hour and 20 minutes, but I never made it home that night. I barely made it 20 miles before pulling into a gas station off Interstate 70 because my hands would not stop shaking. I sat there for nearly 15 minutes staring at the steering wheel while rain tapped against the windshield. At some point, I finally pulled out my phone and called Brian. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. Then I sent a text. I think we should talk when things calm down. No response. 10 minutes later, I texted Angela. I am sorry dinner went badly. She replied almost immediately. I love you, Dad. But maybe give Brian some time. Give Brian some time. Like he was the wounded party in all this. Around 9:30 that night, I checked Facebook by accident while waiting at a red light. Brian had already posted family Thanksgiving photos online. Everybody smiling around the dinner table. Caption, grateful for the people who truly show up for family. I actually laughed out loud when I read it, but it sounded broken even to me. Then I noticed something else. In every single photo, the empty chair where I was supposed to sit had been cropped out. By the time I reached my house near midnight, the loneliness hit harder than the argument itself. The place felt colder than usual. Too quiet. I heated up canned soup I did not eat, then sat in the dark living room scrolling through old voicemails from my late wife because I could not stand the silence anymore. At 1:12 in the morning, my phone buzzed. Again. For one stupid second, I thought maybe Brian was finally calling to apologize. But it was only a group text notification from the family thread. Melissa had renamed it Thanksgiving Weekend Plans. My name was no longer included in the conversation. The next morning did not feel like Thanksgiving. It felt like the morning after a funeral where nobody bothered to tell you what died. I woke up in my recliner around 6:30 with the television still glowing blue in the dark living room and a stiff pain running through my neck. Outside, the world looked gray and frozen. Thin ice clung to the edges of the driveway, and dead leaves scraped across the porch every time the wind blew. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen because silence sounds different when you realize nobody plans to call you. Around 8 in the morning, I checked my phone again. Nothing from Brian. Nothing from Angela. Not even one message asking if I got home safely. The only notification waiting for me was a Black Friday furniture ad and a voicemail from my pharmacy reminding me to refill blood pressure medication. I do not know why that hurt so much, but it did. I made coffee anyway out of habit. 2 cups. Then I caught myself reaching for your mother's favorite mug before remembering she had been gone 8 years already. Funny how grief works. Sometimes it sneaks up on you through tiny motions your body still remembers. I stood there in the kitchen holding that chipped blue mug while snow flurries drifted outside the window. And for the first time in years, I admitted something to myself I had been avoiding. My family did not just tolerate me less over time. They had slowly reorganized their lives around the idea that I no longer mattered. And the worst part was how long I helped them do it. By noon, the loneliness became unbearable enough that I finally called Brian again. Straight to voicemail. I waited an hour and tried Angela. She answered this time, but her voice immediately sounded tense. Dad, now is probably not the best time. I looked around my empty house. Not the best time for what? Talking to your father? She sighed quietly. Brian and Melissa are upset. Upset. I almost laughed again. Angela, they threw me out. Nobody threw you out. That sentence hit me harder than the argument itself because I realized the story had already changed overnight. Somewhere between dinner and Thanksgiving morning, reality had been rewritten. I lowered my voice. So what exactly did Brian tell everybody? Silence. Then she finally answered carefully. He said you got angry about money and left. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. Cleaner that way. Easier. In his version, I was the unstable old man who stormed off after ruining dinner. Did you correct him? Another silence. Longer this time. I just do not want more fighting. That was Angela's specialty. Protecting peace instead of truth. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at old family photos hanging beside the fridge. Brian at 12 holding a hockey trophy. Angela smiling at her college graduation. Christmas mornings. Camping trips. Birthdays. Thousands of little moments frozen in cheap wooden frames. And suddenly I noticed something strange. In almost every photo, I was the one holding the camera. Around 3 in the afternoon, somebody knocked on my front door. For one stupid, hopeful second, I thought maybe Brian had come to apologize. But it was my neighbor Carl from across the street holding a foil-covered plate. Happy Thanksgiving, Walt, he said gently. My wife figured you might not feel like cooking today. I tried smiling. That obvious, huh? Carl hesitated awkwardly before speaking again. Listen, I saw something online this morning. My stomach dropped instantly. What? He rubbed the back of his neck. Melissa posted that family holidays have been difficult because of your behavior lately. Folks in the neighborhood Facebook group started commenting. I felt heat crawl up my chest. What kind of comments? Carl looked embarrassed now. Mostly people saying they are praying for your family. Your family. Not me. Them. I thanked him for the food and shut the door as politely as I could before leaning against it for several seconds in complete silence. That was the moment something finally shifted inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Just clarity. Because when people can publicly humiliate you without guilt, it means they stopped seeing you as a person a long time ago. Around sunset, I walked into the garage behind my house for the first time in months. Dust covered everything. Old tow chains hung from the walls beside rusted tool cabinets. The faded Hayes towing sign still leaned crooked in the corner beneath a tarp. I stood there breathing in oil, cold metal, and old memories when my phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I answered, and a calm, unfamiliar voice said, "Mr. Hayes? My name is Richard Calloway. I believe we may have some business to discuss." The voice on the phone sounded calm, steady, expensive. That is the only way I can describe it now. "Mr. Hayes," the man repeated. "I apologize for calling during the holiday. Frank DeLuca gave me your number." I frowned immediately. "Frank, we spoke earlier today regarding your restoration grant. My company consults with independent towing operators across the Midwest. Frank mentioned your name." I leaned against my dusty workbench inside the garage while cold air drifted through the cracks in the walls. "I have not operated a tow truck in nearly 18 years. The man chuckled softly. "Funny thing about reputation. Good work tends to outlive businesses." His name was Richard Calloway. I recognized it vaguely, but could not place it at first. Then he mentioned Calloway Freight Solutions, and I nearly dropped the phone. Even retired men still watch the news. His company trucks were everywhere across Ohio and Indiana. "Why are you calling me?" I asked carefully. "Because I read your application story this morning," Richard answered. "And because men who build something from nothing usually do not stay down forever." Nobody had spoken to me like that in years. Not like I was still capable of building anything. Richard explained that his company was opening a new roadside assistance division across central Ohio. He wanted experienced independent operators helping train younger crews. "I am 72, I told him honestly. "I do not know how useful I would be." "Walter," he replied, "most people half your age do not know a carburetor from a coffee maker. Experience matters." We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. Longer than I had spoken to anybody in months without feeling like a burden. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me afterward. A man is not finished just because other people stopped appreciating him. The next morning, I unlocked the garage at sunrise. For the first time in years, I did not walk in there to remember old days. I walked into work. Dust floated through cold beams of light from the high windows while I pulled old tarps off equipment I had almost forgotten I owned. Rusted chains, hydraulic jacks, tool cabinets, a faded Hayes towing sign covered in grime. I spent 6 straight hours cleaning without even noticing the time passing. By afternoon, my back hurt, my knees ached, and my hands were black with grease. I had never felt better. Around 3 o'clock, my neighbor Carl wandered over carrying coffee. He stopped dead in the doorway staring around the garage. "Well, I will be damned," he said. "Looks like somebody woke the old place back up." I laughed quietly while tightening bolts on an old winch mount. Trying to. Carl took a slow sip of coffee. "Heard about some grant money. News traveled fast in neighborhoods like ours." "Maybe," I answered. He looked around again before nodding toward the old tow truck parked beneath a tarp in the far bay. "That thing still run?" I walked over and pulled the cover back slowly. Underneath sat my 1994 Ford rollback tow truck. Faded white paint. Rust near the wheel wells. But solid. Reliable. "Has not moved in 6 years," I admitted. Carl grinned. "Bet you $50 she starts." It took us nearly an hour. New battery. Fresh fuel. Some language I probably should not repeat. But when that engine finally turned over with a deep, rough growl echoing through the garage, I swear something inside my chest woke up too. Carl burst out laughing. "There she is." I sat behind the wheel gripping cracked leather while the engine idled beneath me. And suddenly, I did not feel 72 anymore. I felt useful again. That evening, Richard called back. How soon can you meet? He asked. Depends. On what? I glanced through the garage windows at snow beginning to fall outside. On whether this is real. Richard laughed softly. Drive to Indianapolis Monday morning. I will prove it. After hanging up, I stayed in the truck a long time listening to the engine rumble through the old garage. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Brian. First message since Thanksgiving. Dad, heard you are talking to investors now. Maybe we should sit down soon. I stared at that screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down beside me without replying. Outside, snow kept falling quietly across the driveway while the old tow truck headlights cut through the dark like something coming back to life. Monday morning, I drove to Indianapolis before sunrise with a thermos of burnt gas station coffee sitting beside me and $40 cash in my wallet. Snow covered most of Interstate 70, and the old tow truck rattled every time I pushed past 60 miles an hour, but I did not care. For the first time in a long time, I was headed towards something instead of away from it. Callaway Freight Solutions occupied an enormous glass building north of downtown. The parking lot alone looked bigger than my entire old neighborhood. White company trucks lined up in perfect rows beneath giant floodlights, while employees carrying tablets and radios moved quickly between loading bays. I almost turned around right there. Men like me did not belong in places like that anymore. But before I could second-guess myself, a security guard walked out smiling. Walter Hayes. I nodded cautiously. Mr. Callaway has been expecting you. That sentence felt strange in my ears. Expecting you. Not tolerating you. Not fitting you in. Expecting you. The receptionist upstairs greeted me with coffee and called me sir 3 times in under a minute. I had forgotten what respect sounded like when it was not forced. Richard Callaway turned out to be exactly the kind of man his voice suggested. Late 60s. Sharp gray suit. Calm eyes. The kind of person who listened fully before speaking. He shook my hand firmly and smiled. Good. You still look like somebody who knows how to solve problems. I laughed quietly. Depends on the day. His office overlooked the entire freight yard through massive windows. Trucks rolled in and out below us while snow drifted across the loading docks outside. Richard handed me a folder thick with paperwork and maps. Roadside assistance response times across Ohio are terrible, he explained. Too many companies hire kids who can barely change a tire. He leaned back slightly. Frank told me you train some of the best recovery crews in the state. Nobody had talked about my work like that in decades. Most people my age get reduced to memories. Richard talked to me like I still had value in the present tense. We spent nearly 3 hours discussing logistics, emergency response routes, equipment upgrades, winter towing protocols, and driver safety training. At one point, a young operations manager named Trevor walked in carrying a tablet. Could not have been older than 28. Richard pointed toward me immediately. Trevor, this is Walter Hayes. He built recovery routes before GPS existed. The kid smiled politely at first, probably assuming I was just another retired old man visiting the office. Then Richard asked me a question about interstate rollover recovery near Dayton during snow conditions. I answered without even thinking. You close the left lane immediately, angle the rollback 45 degrees behind the wreck, and keep diesel absorbent in the truck because freezing rain turns spilled fuel into black ice in under 10 minutes. Trevor stared at me. How do you know that? Because I watched 3 men almost die from somebody not doing it correctly in 1994. After that, the entire tone changed. By lunchtime, mechanics and drivers kept wandering into the office asking questions. One guy needed advice about winch tension. Another wanted help understanding recovery angles for overturned semis. For hours I found myself standing beside giant digital route screens explaining things with grease-stained hands while people actually listened. Really listened. Around 4 that afternoon, Richard brought me downstairs into the main garage. Bay. Brand new trucks gleamed beneath bright overhead lights while hydraulic lifts hummed in the background. Then he handed me something folded neatly inside plastic packaging. A dark navy work jacket. Embroidered over the chest in white letters were the words, Walter Hayes, Senior Recovery Consultant. I just stared at it silently for several seconds. Richard smiled slightly. Thought you might need a uniform. I ran my fingers slowly over the stitching because nobody had handed me a title in years that was not related to getting older, sicker, or more dependent. But this one felt earned. Trevor walked by and grinned. Looks good on you, Walter. And somehow it did. By the time I drove back toward Ohio that night, snow was falling hard again across the interstate. The old tow truck heater barely worked, but I did not even notice the cold. My phone buzzed twice during the drive. One missed call from Brian. One text from Melissa asking if we could clear up misunderstandings. I left both unanswered while highway lights stretched endlessly ahead through the snowfall. Then somewhere near the Ohio state line, my headlights caught something unusual on the shoulder up ahead. Hazard lights blinking in the dark beside a stranded black SUV. I hit the brakes immediately when I saw the SUV half buried in snow along the shoulder. Hazard lights blinked weakly through the storm, while cars rushed past spraying slush across the highway. The black Range Rover sat tilted awkwardly near the guardrail with one rear tire completely shredded. I pulled the tow truck in behind them, flipped on my emergency lights, and stepped out into freezing wind. The cold hit like knives across my face. A man climbed out of the SUV the second he saw me approaching. Mid-40s maybe. Expensive wool coat already dusted white with snow. Behind him, a woman sat inside, trying to calm two young girls wrapped in blankets. "Sir," the man called out over the wind. "Thank God." Funny thing was, people always sound different when they genuinely need help. There is no ego left in their voice. Just relief. I crouched beside the damaged tire while snow soaked through my jeans almost immediately. "You hit something?" I asked. "Pothole," he answered. "The spare is useless. We have been stuck nearly 40 minutes. One of the little girls rolled down the back window slightly. "Mom says we might miss Grandma's birthday." I smiled at her. "Not if I can help it." The man tried pulling out his wallet immediately. "Whatever this costs, I will cover it." But I shook my head. "Get your family warm first." 20 minutes later, I had the SUV secured on the rollback while the family sat inside my truck cab drinking stale vending machine cocoa I found behind the seat. The girls kept asking questions about the buttons and towing equipment while their mother laughed softly for the first time all night. "You must have done this forever," she said. "Feels like it," I answered. The father introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. Something about the name sounded familiar, but I could not place it yet. Mostly because I was too busy concentrating on icy roads and visibility dropping by the minute. During the drive, Daniel kept trying to make conversation. "So how long have you owned your company?" "Used to own one," I corrected. "Just getting started again." He nodded thoughtfully. "That usually means somebody underestimated you." I glanced at him briefly, but said nothing. Some people notice more than they let on. About 45 minutes later, we finally exited the interstate and drove through a gated neighborhood north of Columbus filled with enormous stone houses sitting behind iron fences and frozen fountains. I actually thought the GPS had malfunctioned at first. Then Daniel pointed ahead casually. "Second driveway on the left." The moment we pulled up, I felt my hands tighten around the steering wheel. The house looked less like a home and more like a luxury hotel. Massive windows glowing warm against the snow. 3-car garage. Circular driveway lined with Christmas lights wrapped perfectly around bare trees. I climbed out slowly while staring at the place. Daniel noticed immediately and smiled faintly. "I know. It is a little much." "A little much." I almost laughed. The girls ran toward the front door, shouting while their mother thanked me again. Then Daniel walked back toward me through the snow and extended his hand. "Walter, you probably saved us from spending the night stranded out there." I shook his hand firmly. "Just doing the job." "No," he answered quietly. "Most people stopped doing that years ago." Then the front door opened and warm light spilled across the driveway. An older woman stepped outside smiling. "Daniel, finally." She stopped when she saw me standing beside the tow truck. "And who is this?" Daniel turned toward her naturally. "Mom, this is Walter Hayes. He got us home safely tonight." The woman's expression changed instantly. Not because she recognized me personally, because she recognized the name. "Hayes," she repeated carefully. Then another voice echoed from inside the house. "Did you say Walter Hayes?" A tall, silver-haired man appeared in the doorway holding a glass of wine. The second he saw me standing there in the snow beside that old tow truck, he froze completely. And suddenly I recognized him too. Richard Calloway. For several seconds, nobody moved. Snow drifted quietly through the headlights while warm light from the mansion spilled across the driveway behind Richard Calloway. Daniel looked confused immediately. "Wait, you two know each other?" Richard stepped forward slowly, still staring at me in disbelief. Walter was supposed to come to Indianapolis this week. I blinked. You never mentioned your son was stranded on Interstate 70. Richard actually laughed softly at that. And you never mentioned you would rescue my family before officially working for me. Something about the absurdity of it finally broke the tension a little. Daniel looked between us carefully. Dad, this is the Walter Hayes. Richard nodded once. The Walter Hayes. I still had snow melting off my jacket and grease on my hands while standing in front of one of the wealthiest freight executives in the Midwest, and somehow I felt more comfortable than I had sitting at my own family's dinner table days earlier. Richard motioned toward the house. At least come inside long enough to warm up. Normally, I would have refused out of politeness. But the cold had settled deep into my knees by then, so I finally nodded. The house smelled like cedar wood, cinnamon, and fresh coffee. Massive stone fireplace. Family photos lining the walls. Grandchildren running through the halls laughing while somebody played soft jazz music in another room. Expensive, yes, but lived in. Warm. Daniel's wife disappeared into the kitchen immediately and returned with coffee and homemade pie. Real pie this time. Richard noticed me staring briefly at the family photos above the fireplace. My wife insists on printing everything, he said. Drives the kids crazy. One photo caught my attention immediately. Daniel standing beside Richard at what looked like a company event. Another showed Richard shaking hands with state officials at some transportation conference. Then I saw one final picture near the end of the shelf. A framed newspaper clipping. Callaway Freight saves historic Ohio recovery business. Underneath the headline was a photograph of a younger Richard standing beside an old towing garage. My garage. Hayes Towing. I stepped closer automatically. Richard walked beside me quietly. You remember that? He asked. 1998. I answered without thinking. Your driver jackknifed 2 freight trailers outside Zanesville during an ice storm. Richard smiled slowly. And every recovery company refused the job except you. The memory came back instantly. 20-hour storm. Frozen hydraulic lines. National Guard closing roads. I barely slept for 2 days getting those trailers out safely. Richard folded his arms loosely. You saved my company nearly $500,000 that week. I stared at the article again. I was just doing the work. Exactly, Richard answered. That is why I remembered you. Daniel looked genuinely shocked now. Dad talks about that storm constantly. Then Richard added something else quietly. You know, when Frank showed me your grant application, I did not call you out of charity. He looked directly at me. I called because men like you are rare. Nobody had spoken to me that way in a very long time. A little later, while I stood near the fireplace warming my hands, my phone suddenly buzzed again. Brian. I almost ignored it. But Richard glanced at the screen and simply said, Take it. So I answered. Hello. Brian's voice sounded unusually careful. Dad, where are you? I looked around the enormous room filled with warmth, conversation, and people who actually seemed happy I was there. Working, I answered. Silence. Then Brian cleared his throat awkwardly. Melissa saw something online. What kind of something? A business post. About Callaway Freight hiring a senior recovery consultant. I said nothing. Brian lowered his voice further. Dad, is that you? Before I could answer, Richard walked past behind me and called out naturally. Walter, Daniel wants to show you the new recovery fleet tomorrow morning. There was complete silence on the other end of the phone. Absolute silence. Then Brian spoke again, but this time his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. You are with Richard Callaway right now? I looked through the giant windows where snow continued falling softly across the estate driveway and realized something strange. For the first time in years, I was no longer the one trying to hold on to everybody else. Now they were suddenly terrified of losing me. Everything changed after that phone call. Not overnight exactly. More like watching ice crack slowly across a frozen lake until one morning you realize the whole surface has shifted underneath you. By Tuesday afternoon, the announcement from Callaway Freight had spread across local transportation pages, logistics groups, and business newsletters all over Ohio. Somebody from Richard's media team posted photos from the Indianapolis training facility. In one picture, I stood beside 2 younger operators wearing the Navy Callaway jacket with senior recovery consultant stitched across the chest. I looked older than everybody else in the room, but I also looked solid, steady, useful. By Wednesday morning, my phone would not stop vibrating. Brian called 3 times before 9 o'clock. Angela texted asking if we could clear the air. Melissa sent a message so carefully worded it sounded like a customer service email. Walter, I think there were misunderstandings on both sides during Thanksgiving. Both sides. I stared at that sentence for nearly a full minute before putting the phone down again. Around noon, I drove to the old garage because Richard had arranged for surveyors to inspect the property before renovations started. 3 white company trucks already sat outside when I arrived. Men carrying clipboards moved through the bays measuring electrical lines and foundation supports, while another crew unloaded new tool cabinets from a trailer. The place smelled alive again. Sawdust, welding sparks, coffee, work. Trevor waved the second he saw me pull in. Walter, you are going to love this. He walked me toward the back office where somebody had mounted a brand new metal sign beside the door. Hayes Recovery Operations Training Division. I actually stopped walking for a second. Richard approved it this morning, Trevor said with a grin. Said the name belongs here. Before I could answer, another truck pulled into the lot behind me. Dark blue SUV. Brian climbed out slowly while Angela followed behind him, adjusting her coat against the wind. I noticed immediately that neither of them looked angry anymore. Just nervous. Trevor glanced between us carefully. You want me to give you some space? Please, I answered quietly. He nodded and walked back toward the garage without another word. Brian approached first with both hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. Dad, funny thing about hearing your child say one simple word after weeks of silence. Sometimes it sounds familiar. Sometimes it sounds like a stranger borrowing somebody else's voice. Angela hugged herself against the cold. This place looks amazing. I looked around the garage slowly before answering. It is getting there. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after that. Wind rattled the loose metal gutters overhead, while workers moved equipment somewhere deeper inside the building. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. Dad, I think things got out of hand on Thanksgiving. I said nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck. Melissa should not have posted those things online. But she did. She was upset. So was I. Silence again. Angela stepped forward carefully now. Dad, nobody wanted things to become this bad. I looked directly at her. Then why did nobody stop it? Her eyes dropped immediately. That was answer enough. Brian tried again. Look, maybe we all handled things poorly. There it was again. That careful shared language people use when they want forgiveness without fully admitting guilt. We all handled things poorly, as if humiliation and silence carried equal weight. I leaned against the side of the tow truck slowly. Brian, do you know what bothered me most? He looked genuinely uncertain. It was not being asked to leave. He blinked. Then what? It was realizing how easy it had become for everybody. Neither of them spoke after that, because deep down, they knew exactly what I meant. The workers inside the garage suddenly rolled up the main bay door with a loud metallic crash, revealing the entire renovated workspace glowing under bright new lights. Hydraulic lifts, fresh concrete floors, new recovery equipment lined perfectly against the walls. Brian stared at everything in complete silence. Jesus, he whispered softly. Then Richard's black sedan pulled into the lot behind them. He stepped out calmly, holding several folders beneath one arm before walking toward us. Good, he said casually. Everybody is here. Brian immediately straightened awkwardly. Richard shook my hand first before acknowledging the others. You must be Walter's children. Something about hearing another man define them that way instead of the other way around shifted the entire air around us. Then Richard handed me the top folder. I opened it slowly and felt my stomach tighten the second I saw the documents inside. Property transfer papers, ownership agreements, and directly beneath them, a partnership contract listing my name beside his. 3 months later, the garage officially reopened. Not the way it used to be. Better, cleaner, stronger. The old cracked Hayes towing sign still hung out front because I refused to replace it completely, but now fresh, white letters underneath read, Hayes Recovery and Training Division, partnered with Callaway Freight Solutions. Every morning before sunrise, young operators rolled into the lot carrying coffee cups and tool bags while snowplows cleared the driveway outside. Some of them were veterans trying to start over. Some were kids barely out of technical school. Most had never worked with their hands long enough to understand what responsibility really looked like yet. That became my job. Not just teaching towing and recovery work. Teaching patience, calm, pride in doing difficult things correctly even when nobody notices. Funny enough, The work gave me something I had not felt in years. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from everybody liking you. The kind that comes from finally knowing who you are without asking permission first. Around Christmas, Brian came by the garage alone one afternoon. I saw his truck pull in while I was helping Trevor inspect recovery straps near Bay 2. Brian stepped out slowly wearing the same brown winter coat he always wore during hockey season years ago. For a second, I did not see a 45-year-old man standing there. I saw the kid who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat after early morning practices while I drove us home through snowstorms. He walked toward me carefully. "You busy?" "Little bit," I answered. Trevor quietly disappeared into the back office without saying a word. Brian shoved both hands into his pockets and looked around the garage. "This place looks incredible." "Thank you." Silence settled between us for a few moments while welding sparks flashed somewhere deeper inside the building. Then Brian finally spoke again. "I owe you an apology." I studied his face carefully because for once, he sounded honest. Not strategic. Not nervous about money. Just tired. "You do," I answered quietly. He nodded once. "I kept telling myself Thanksgiving was one bad night." He looked down at the concrete floor. "But the truth is, I got too comfortable thinking you would always stay no matter how we treated you. Hearing your child admit something painful does not magically erase the damage. Movies lie about that. Healing is slower. Stranger. Sometimes forgiveness begins quietly long before trust returns." I wiped grease from my hands with an old rag and leaned against the workbench. "Brian, I spent years confusing being needed with being loved." He looked up at me immediately. "Dad, no. Listen." My voice stayed calm. "Helping family matters. But if you keep giving people pieces of yourself while they stop seeing your value, eventually you disappear." Neither of us spoke after that. We did not hug dramatically. We did not suddenly become perfect. But before leaving, Brian looked around the garage one more time and asked softly, "Would it be all right if Ethan came by sometime? He talks about this place constantly." And for the first time in a very long while, I answered without resentment. "I would like that." Angela visited later that week with homemade cinnamon bread and cried halfway through coffee in my office because guilt finally caught up with her. Melissa never fully apologized. Honestly, I stopped needing her to. That was another thing I learned getting older. Closure does not always arrive wrapped in the words you hoped for. Sometimes closure is simply reaching a point where someone else's approval no longer controls your peace. The strange part is, none of this became about money in the end. Yes, the partnership changed my life financially. Yes, the garage succeeded faster than anybody expected. But the real change happened the night I stopped begging to be treated with dignity by people who had grown comfortable with holding it. That was the real turning point. Nowadays, every Thanksgiving looks different. Last year, Richard and his family invited me over again after the garage closed early for the holiday. Snow drifted softly outside their windows while the girls argued over board games and Daniel burned dinner rolls trying to help in the kitchen. At one point, Richard handed me a glass of bourbon and nodded toward the chaos around the house. "Funny thing about family," he said. "Sometimes life introduces you to the right one late." I remember standing near the fireplace afterward holding that warm glass while looking out at the snow-covered driveway glowing beneath Christmas lights. And for the first time in many years, I did not feel lonely during the holidays anymore. If you are out there listening tonight and somebody in your life has slowly convinced you that your kindness makes you weak, please hear me carefully. It does not. But kindness without boundaries becomes permission for people to take pieces of you until there is nothing left. Protect your peace. Protect your finances. Protect your sense of self. And when your instincts tell you something feels wrong inside a relationship, a friendship, even a family, listen. God, or the universe, or whatever you believe in, usually whispers long before life finally forces you to hear it. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 72 years old. And the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never hand someone so much power over your life that you forget your own worth standing without them. Thank you for sitting with me through this story tonight. Truly, I think a lot more people are carrying quiet heartbreak than we realize, especially during the holidays. So if this story reminded you of someone you love, or maybe reminded you to love yourself a little better, I hope you carry that feeling with you tonight. And if you want, leave a comment sharing where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I still read every one of them. There are more stories waiting in this playlist. Stories about families, betrayal, second chances, and the strange ways life sometimes rebuilds us after everything falls apart. So if you are not ready to leave just yet, stay a little longer. I think the next story might speak to your heart too.